thank Levi for opening up this space and getting us all here together. And I also want to acknowledge that tonight is the first night of two. Tonight is going to be more of a storytelling. I like to think of the three of us as being bards, going across the country, collecting stories and sharing those stories with people, and learning and creating a more collaborative story about not just disasters, but more importantly, the way in which we respond to those things. And so before we get into that, I just want to preface that tonight is going to be not only just storytelling, but also using different images, different principles, and different skills and stories that we've learned, that we've collected through not just the past couple of decades, but the past couple of centuries, through the legacy of colonization, and how that colonial legacy, the legacy of occupying and conquering land, precipitates all of the disasters that we are interacting with today. And we can call these things invisible disasters, the invisible disasters of capitalism, patriarchy, racism, homophobia, and all of these terrible things, which exemplify all of the different what we call natural disasters that we experience on a day-to-day basis, or the industrial breakdown of our society as we're thinking about the Rust Belt and things like this, where we think about collapse in these different senses too. We talk about what's called mutual aid. It's in our name, mutual aid disaster relief. What is mutual aid? What is that term? How does it break down? And getting into that, we like to think that mutual aid is a system of reciprocity. It's a system of exchange. It's the really, really free market. It's not a commodified idea. It's not something you can sell. It's not something that we do tit for tat for. I give to you and now you owe me exactly X.5 of these. It's nothing like that. Rather, we're thinking about an organic process of sharing, of resource exchange, of energy transference. If we think of mycelium in the forest, if we think of these underground networks of fungus that connect the roots of trees, they act as an internet, allowing different plants in the forest to communicate through energy or through nutrient sharing. And this isn't something that is commodified, it's not industrialized, it isn't based in the next concept that we think of, which is solidarity, not charity. This charity model of creating red tape, creating these different institutional frameworks for delivering aid to create the powerful givers of aid and the passive receivers. Rather, what we like to do is break through that paradigm and enter into what we like to call dual power. So thinking once again about the organic nature of mutual aid, we see it in nature. Darwin didn't just write about the survival of the fittest, but he also spoke about mutual aid. This aspect in nature where plants and animals, where the whole cosmos is built around this concept of reciprocity, of free exchange of energy. Because if there's a clustering of energy, it becomes corroded. And so thinking about dual power, we think about composting the old world rather than just destroying it. We think about composting this, taking its nutrients and being able to then also plant the seeds for a new. So the composting work and the growing as well. And that gets into the next one, which is self-determination, not asking for permission from higher ups to do the good work of doing this social gardening, as I like to refer to it. Thinking also about mandar obedeciendo, which is a term adopted from the Zapatistas. We'll get into a little bit about who they are in just a moment. But to preface that conversation, the Zapatistas are a revolutionary group of indigenous land protectors who have been working for about 30 years to protect their indigenous lands in southern Mexico. And this phrase roughly translates to leading by obeying. So listening with our ears and with our hearts to the voices of the people who are the most affected, and taking point with where they're at. And also horizontality, the idea that rather than thinking about top-down structures, we can move in a way that's shoulder to shoulder, in a circle with our comrades. If one of us falls down, we can pick each other up. There are no leaders here, we're all leaders in this space. And then thinking also about autonomous direct action. Once again, this concept of not having to ask for permission, but of actually truly building consent, of building relationships with our comrades, with our neighbors, with our families, and with our friends. And next, we like to talk about sustainability. Once again, getting back into the system. These all recycle into each other. Mutual aid is in and of itself a sustainable system. But when we talk about sustainability, that concept sort of gets thrown around by institutions, by universities. Every campus now is a sustainable green space. And so thinking about things like this, what is it that we're actually trying to sustain? Are we trying to sustain the world that we're in right now? Are we clinging to this world and thinking about, well, if we just green it up a little bit, perhaps things could get better? Rather, what we like to do is work towards the next concept, which is intersectionality. Thinking about, once again, like these mycological networks, all of these different intersecting points, these are representative of us. We have within us at all times all of these different intersecting passions, hopes, and fears, experiences that bind us together in all of our fates with this entire planet, all of the material and immaterial things that connect us, which lead us towards collective liberation. Thinking about this concept that all of our fates being intertwined, if one of us is still shackled, we all are. None of us are free until all of us are free. So thinking about that idea of sustainability, once again, we cannot do this if we're trying to sustain the world that we're currently in. We have to truly compost the old to plant the seeds of a new. And so thinking about all of that, we have to understand where we came from. How is it that we got here? Why does patriarchy exist? We can't solve all of these questions tonight, so we're going to start off with the history of colonization on this continent, starting with Christopher Columbus in 1492. And so with the images of the Beehive Collective, we're going to act as diviners to draw different images like tarot cards almost, if you're familiar with those, to talk about these different concepts of colonization and the responses to them, to that legacy. And so without further ado, I'd like to invite Tyler up here to bring us into that space and to lay down the groundwork of why it is that we're responding to these disasters today.
Hi everyone. So I also work with a group called the Beehive Collective. The Beehive Collective is a bunch of activists and artists and educators and organizers. We work collaboratively to make storytelling graphics, kind of like these plants and animals are working together to make murals and other arts and crafts. We work collaboratively to make graphics that use fable-style symbolic animal stories to talk about real-life environmental and social justice issues. To make these topics that are hard to understand and often even harder to talk about more accessible and approachable to diverse audiences. I've got lots of posters, and in fact, if those little ones down there want something else to do later, they can look at cute critters and stuff too, because this work is really good for kids. It's good for adults as well, but it's we're trying to make, we print not only posters but also giant fabric versions of our graphics, which become sort of like portable murals, so that we can take art outside of art galleries into people's lives, make it relevant to them, and we're trying to create an educational model that can tackle really heavy topics and make them more easier and hopefully even fun to talk about. And my favorite thing about using pictures to tell stories is that they're flexible. We can reinterpret them. We can appropriate the metaphors and change them depending on the audience, or change them on depending on what is the newest news. Or maybe like these middle school students at a school in Chicago, they're reinterpreting the characters and scenes from the Mesoamerica Resiste graphic to talk about their own lives and their own experiences. So that's what we're doing here tonight, actually. We're using the anti-copyright graphics of the Beehive Collective and some other groups to help to tell our stories. We're highlighting scenes and characters from these 4 graphics. Mesoamerica Resiste is all about resistance movements in Central America, especially what indigenous people are doing to protect their land and their communities and their culture from destructive industrial development projects and sort of neo-colonization. A little closer to home, The True Cost of Coal is all about mountaintop removal coal mining in the Central Appalachian Mountains, and fossil fuel use in general and extreme resource extraction in general here in the United States. The 2 on the right side, if any of you are fans of the Beehive Collective, you might be excited to see these because we didn't make them. Actually, other groups made them. I think that's really exciting. They were inspired by the Beehive Collective. Proyecte Uter is made by a group based in Spain, and it's about abortion and reproductive rights and other gender-related issues. And on the far right, Waterways was just published a few months ago, like 3 months ago now, by a group based in Philly, and it's all about fracking and water pollution and what people are doing to defend the land and water in Pennsylvania. So the stories that we're going to be telling tonight are different than the stories that were originally encoded in these graphics, but they're related to them, and they kind of encompass all of them. So tonight we're going to be talking about protectors versus profiteers, communities in resistance to disaster capitalism. And as we get started into that, it's important that we understand what we mean by disaster capitalism. So I think the simplest way to explain it is that disaster capitalism means a form of elite opportunism, mostly corporations, stealing and extracting wealth from the poorest and most vulnerable by taking advantage of shocks. That's a word that Naomi Klein uses. If you're familiar with that author, her book, The Shock Doctrine, is excellent. I'd recommend it if you ever get a chance to read it. But she uses the term shocks to refer to confusion and desperation that survivors feel in the aftermath of losing everything to a hurricane or a tornado or a war. And disaster capitalists come in and take advantage of these shocks by tricking or coercing communities and individuals into giving up local control, democracy, and human rights. We have a few faceless specters from the Mesoamerica graphic that are going to sort of show us the three primary tactics of disaster capitalism. And these are all these characters, like this one representing the World Bank. They're all references to, they're all characters representing global financial institutions. So a little bit later we're going to come back to talking about the newest form of capitalism, which is called neoliberalism, and it's okay if you don't know what that word means because it doesn't mean anything. It means new and free, right? It's just like a really nice sounding name to cover up the same old thing. And we'll get into that, but first I want to talk about these three primary tactics so that we have clarity about what we mean when we say disaster capitalism. Here we see this casino capitalism gambler representing the World Bank is making money off of pollution. It's playing this game where the game is rigged, right? There's a lot of poker chips on North America and Europe over here, and there's only a few chips on South America and Africa, and they're inside of these bear traps to represent predatory lending. So not only do banks give homeowners mortgages that they know they can never pay back, and then make tons of money off of it, that sort of swindling, but also on an international level. Banks like the World Bank are doing exactly these types of loans with high interest rates and lots of strings attached to cities or even whole countries. And then when these countries are not able to pay these loans back, other financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, come in, and the IMF here is represented as a surgeon that's cutting out public services like electricity and water, other things like education. They come in when the countries can't pay their debts off. They come in and say, okay, well, we'll give you a new loan. We'll buy out your old loan. It'll be a better interest rate. But, you just have to sign the dotted line here, which says that we're going to do structural adjustment programs, gutting out these public services, privatizing them, right? Taking public goods and turning them into the private property of corporations. Then the third tactic is represented by this cash register conquistador who has finger puppet government officials who are shaking down the taxpayers to fill this cash register drawer. This character represents development banks that are using war and terrorism as an opportunity to push industrial development and to make profit off of destruction and misery. The war on terror, the so-called war on terror, which really ought to be called the war of terror, was designed to be an unwinnable war. It was designed to be an endless war, and that's the third tactic that I want to talk about. Is this concept of endless war? That the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were designed to be unwinnable wars in the sense of defeating the enemy and moving on, signing a treaty and moving on. But Bush Jr. and company rolled right into those because they knew that this endless war was highly profitable. In fact, there are more private contractors occupying Iraq and Afghanistan than there are military troops. Always have been since the beginning. And so the Bechtels and the Halliburtons and the Blackwaters and all of these corporations are making enormous profits off of destroying other people's lives. And these tactics are pushed by governments and corporations every day, but in crises, especially in the wake of natural disasters, they come in with shocking speed. So we're going to come back to talking about disaster capitalism and neoliberalism, understanding, really clearly what what's going on in the world in general nowadays. But in order to really fully understand it, we first need to take this big step back to look at a 500-year legacy of colonization, because the era of colonization is not over. It's not something that happened in the past and it's done now. We're still living right in the middle of it. So it's really important to understanding what we're dealing with today. So we're going to zoom in on this conquistador, and I'm going to use this picture to talk about Christopher Columbus. Right? Let's start at the beginning. Right? And when Columbus landed on the island that he called Hispaniola, it was originally called Haiti. It's now two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. He was greeted by surprised but very friendly and caring Taino people. He wrote in his diary, "They are artless and generous with what they have. Of anything they have, if it be asked for, they never say no, but do rather invite the person to accept it, and show as much lovingness as though they would give their hearts." That to me sounds like a culture of mutual aid, right? That's actually exactly the type of love and generosity and sharing that we're fighting for, in our better world. But Columbus, of course, as we know, he didn't return the favor. In fact, he also noted that they had no steel weapons, and just a few pages later in his diary, he wrote, "With 50 men, they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them." And that's exactly what he did. He returned 1 year later with an army of conquerors. Can you go to the next one, please, Jimmy? And terrorized and enslaved the Taino people and other peoples of the Caribbean, including Boricua, which he called Puerto Rico. We'll talk more about that island later. This gold boat is very important to understanding the history of colonization. Here we see gold artifacts in this treasure chest are being melted down in the middle into these ingots to fill the banks of Europe. I read recently that the total amount of gold that was stolen from the Americas, was 40 times the total amount of gold that existed in all of Europe prior to colonization. So think about that for a moment. That fact alone completely changed the balance of global economies and trade, and it totally shifted the balance of empires in Asia and versus Europe, which was like a backwater before they started stealing from the Americas. And because there's kids in the audience, I'm not going to tell the story of how they got this gold. Like when I use words like terrorism to describe Christopher Columbus, it's really, really awful stories. And so the legacy of colonization is a legacy of theft, it's a legacy of violence, and it's a legacy of genocide. Here, as the people of the Caribbean were terrorized and killed by the Spaniards and later the French, they also lost countless lives to smallpox and other foreign diseases. In fact, in barely 50 years, almost all Taino people on Hispaniola were killed. It's really important to say that not entirely all, and that's really important to say because there are Taino people to this day who are fighting against colonization just as their ancestors have done from the very beginning. But at that time, in the early days of colonizing the Caribbean, the conquistadors had started these mines and these feudal-style plantations, and they needed slaves to work in these industries. And so they turned to capturing prisoners elsewhere and bringing them to the Americas. And this is what began the transatlantic slave trade. Here we see these three boats representing what's often called the triangle trade. You recognize the gold boat over here. This one is a sugar boat. You see King Kool-Aid. Some of the other details on here are funny, so I'll point out the sugarcane masts and cupcake crow's nests, and the flags are teeth full of cavities. And then this one down here is a slave boat full of prisoners, and it has references to modern day slavery in the form of prison guard towers and surveillance cameras. During the triangle trade, over the course of hundreds of years, there were these regular triangular route where ships carrying sugar and rum would sail from the plantations in the Americas to Europe. There they would trade it for gold and also guns, and they would take that gold and guns to ports in West Africa and trade them for prisoners. Then they would take those prisoners back to the plantations to create more sugar and rum, which allowed them to have more gold and guns, which allowed them to purchase more prisoners, and on and on and on. And this story is really important to understand regarding the history of colonization, because actually, in a way, it kind of crystallizes the fundamental logic of colonization. It's this sort of self-reinforcing cycle that I think the simplest way to understand it, it basically has 5 parts. Colonizers invade someone else's land, and then they take whatever they find there. That may be resources or the land itself or human bodies themselves. In step 3, they make new stuff out of these resources that they now have an excess of. They make new technology, they make factories, they make new weapons, they make armies and navies. You know, the British clear-cut all of New England to make the famous British Navy that went on to conquer other parts of the world, which brings us to step 4, which is to expand infrastructure and expand technology and expand reach and power, so that step 5, the colonizers can repeat and go invade another land and take and make and expand again. And this aspect of colonization was essential to the birth of capitalism. It was also, I mean, so much of our modern history was based on this stolen wealth. The Industrial Revolution would not have happened if it weren't for colonization. Capitalism means, like, a system by which people make use of capital. Capital is extra wealth that you have just sitting around. Where did that extra wealth that was just sitting around come from, right? It was that 40 times gold that was stolen. So, over hundreds of years of this, so Columbus himself established the model for colonization: aggressive theft, deception, terrorism, and this cycle over hundreds of years created an ever-growing pyramid scheme in which power and resources always flow up, and abuse and oppression and environmental degradation always flow down. Here we see the Virginia State House has this pyramid scheme, you know, is holding up this pyramid scheme with tribute in the form of taxes. And in the next scene, we see that it's built on a foundation of lumber and cotton and coal. It's attached to a coal-fired textile mill, one of the most important industries in the 13 colonies. And so we see these other resource extraction arms are gobbling up different resources. All this stuff started in the Americas, but then bounced all around all over the world. As we move into modern history, these older machines turn into a big coal-fired power plant monster that is towing a train of factories behind it. It has references to U.S. military empire, because the smokestacks are Gatling guns and the transformers are missiles. You know, this industrial war machine is defending the 1% at the top of the pyramid, while the vast majority of folks are getting pushed down into this cycle. This is called the dance of hard choices. It's a sort of cycle of debt and desperation, where we see the frog miner is getting a paycheck for destroying the land for coal mining or other forms of mining, and then maybe it gets hurt on the job, or maybe it has some pain in its kidneys because the water coming out of the tap is black because of the pollution. And then in step 3, the frog miner hands over a huge wad of cash because it doesn't have insurance anymore because the unions have been busted, and it's buying these highly addictive prescription painkillers like opioids, while the little one is getting this bottle of water. And in step 4, frog miner has only one little coin left, so it puts its hard hat back on and heads back to work. While this little one is scratching its head and wondering if there's any way out of this cycle of debt. So another really important thing to understand about the history of colonization is how corporations played into it. The very first use of the concept of corporation was in the Roman Empire. That's why this character has one arm, which is a fasces. A fasces is an axe wrapped inside of a bundle of sticks. It's a symbol of Roman Empire, and it's also the chosen symbol of fascism. You can see here it's holding up a scale which is terribly unbalanced. The needs and wants of the 1%, represented by a top hat on a velvet pillow, outweigh the lives of indigenous people from around the world. And the corporation as we know it today actually got its start in the British Empire. They were originally called crown corporations, and crown corporations were special new companies that were created with a special contract. They were empowered and privileged directly by the king himself, and they were funded by aristocratic investors. The purpose of a crown corporation was to conquer and administer colonies. Their mission was to, by any means necessary, to seize monopoly control of resources, markets, and trade within their given territory, and to subjugate and tax everyone in order to send ever-increasing profits back to the stockholders. Crown corporations had the power to write laws, they had the power to conscript armies, they had the power to execute troublemakers. You may have heard of some of the more famous crown corporations like the Hudson Bay Company or the East India Company. Each of the 13 colonies had a corporate overlord. The Virginia Company was fairly famous as well. And also really important thing to understand about the history of colonization is that there was endless resistance to it from the very beginning up until today. We're going to focus on a few stories from a particular era that was really important to resistance in this country between the 1880s and the 1930s. This was the era of the robber barons. This is an era that's very important to understand because it's similar to the one that we're in right now. It was a time during which laws were being dismantled and a tiny minority was amassing all of the power and wealth while the vast majority of people were being pushed further and further into poverty. It was also an era of huge populist uprisings of many different kinds. And it was also an era of union movements and fights for democracy and dignity and human rights. And one union in particular that was really important during this era was the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, or the Wobblies. They agitated for human rights and democracy and dignity. They sang songs about solidarity forever. They tried to build one big union, a place in which all working people could fit, a place in which an injury to one is an injury to all, and people really truly watched out for one another. An organization, a nationwide organization of mutual aid. So here these minor ants are learning about solidarity. They're learning how to link arms and form a picket line. The most inspiring aspects of the Wobblies were the fact that they organized across all industries, they organized across all races, and they organized all across the country to spread inspiring ideas and to encourage poor people to stand up for themselves. They were very successful in it. They were in many ways leading the union movement, and they were helping people to win things like 8-hour day and fair pay and safety standards and things of that nature. And for that reason, there was massive retaliation from the state and from landlords and corporations and these robber baron types. And a lot of the leaders of the Wobblies were framed and or assassinated. But they never gave up. And in fact, they're still going today. In fact, they're having a resurgence nowadays. And the Wobblies are organizing some people that the other unions never would touch, like Walmart workers and Starbucks workers and even sex workers. And so now, over 100 years later, they're still inspiring folks and presenting a model that might work a little better than the traditional union model. Another mutual aid organization from that era, it was called the Catholic Worker. In 1906, during the San Francisco earthquake, a young girl named Dorothy Day witnessed terrible devastation, but also incredible, all these examples of voluntary mutual aid. Neighbors and even strangers were feeding and housing one another. And even though the army had been called in to forcibly evacuate people, they were shooting looters, though really it was just trying to push out the poor people so they could gentrify the area. Yes, it's true, that happened 100 years ago and it still happens today. But people held their ground and they maintained their community. And Dorothy Day wrote in her diary, while the crisis lasted, people loved one another. So here we see some bees are feeding their neighbors. We'll see some paper wasps who are living and working cooperatively to show that in the 1930s, Dorothy Day started the Catholic Worker as a permanent institution of mutual aid. And the most popular aspect of that, and the one that's still lasting today, is the houses of hospitality. The houses of hospitality were different from like a homeless shelter as we would think of it today, because those in need, people who needed food or a roof over their head or a hot shower or just some community, they were actively participating in running these spaces, figuring out programs that how they could make some money and make a living, figuring out how to grow food together. and really just sort of exemplifying this mutual aid. And the Catholic workers are still around nearly 100 years later as well. They're especially involved in anti-war movements and anti-nuclear movements. One more story from that era that is really relevant to where we are today actually takes place south of the border. In 1919, in the Mexican Revolution, Emiliano Zapata and his followers fought, in some cases risked their lives with guns and fought against the super corrupt colonial, still it was not, it was not a colony of Spain anymore, but it was still a colonial system where a tiny minority owned almost all of the land. And the campesinos, the peasant farmers, the indigenous people, couldn't even, manage their own lives because they didn't have access to the land. So that's what Zapata was fighting for. They fought for land reform. They fought for returning land to the people. And in the end, when the new Mexican Constitution was written, they didn't get quite everything that they had hoped for, but they did get very large amounts of communal land handed back over to indigenous campesinos and protected in the Constitution itself. And so here we see a scene of celebration. These animals are celebrating their victories with a square dance. They're having a picnic with all this food they've grown, and they're celebrating victories like the 8-hour day, represented by this clock with 8s on it. The flag over on that side has a medical symbol on it to represent healthcare and workers' compensation and safety standards and many things that unions won for us. This wasn't only a time of union battles, though. This was also the era during which women won the right to vote. There were farmers' rights movements. There were immigrants' rights movements. African Americans were fighting daily to survive through the Jim Crow era of imprisonment so that they could build power and knowledge for their uprising that would come a couple of decades later. And also during this era, there was a secretive elite counter-movement that was facilitated primarily by the Supreme Court. So in 1886, the Supreme Court made a strange and fateful decision. In a case brought by Southern Pacific Railroad, the corporate lawyers argued that corporations deserved equal protection under the law. If that sounds familiar to you, it's because it's from the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment says equal protection under the law means that people can't be denied their rights because of their race or their gender or whatever. I want to take a little step back to really understand these amendments, because this is some like legal shenanigans that I'm about to describe here. So the 13th Amendment, remember, that's the one that abolished slavery. It says that it's no longer legal for a person to be forced to work and not paid. It does, however, have one gigantic loophole in it. It says, except in the case of people who are convicted of a crime, which is the reason that we still have slavery in this country, which is the reason that there are more prisoners in this country than any other country in the world. In fact, 25% of the total prisoners in the entire world are in this country. If you count all the people on their way to prison, in the court system, and all the people who haven't made it out the other side because they're still stuck in parole, they're not really free yet, it's like over 9 million people now. That is like 2% of the whole population. It's completely crazy. Are in jail at any given moment, right? That's not the people who've been to jail. That's like in the system right now. And so the 14th Amendment is closely connected to this, and it also has this wild loophole in it. The 14th Amendment says this thing about equal protection under the law, and it also has some other language necessary to change the original Constitution language. It basically changes property, or slaves, into persons or citizens. And so the lawyers for Southern Pacific Railroad argued that meant that corporations had been turned into citizens because property into persons. And the Supreme Court agreed with them. And the effect of this decision is that it gave corporations what they call personhood, which gave them rights like freedom of religion and freedom of speech and things of that nature. And it also effectively shielded the decision makers from being held accountable for their actions. So, if a mining company comes in and clear cuts the forest and strip mines the earth and pollutes the water and destroys your community, and you go to the CEO and you go to the shareholders and you go to these decision makers and you say, look what you've done, you've totally ruined everything, you should be punished for this, isn't there some law against this? Well, they get to say, here in the United States of America, they have the privilege to say, actually no, I didn't do that. It wasn't me. It was that corporation guy that did it. Good luck putting handcuffs on that corporation guy. Right? And so now, have you all heard of Citizens United? It's a court case that happened in, I think, about 2010. Citizens United literally means Corporations United. And it was a court case in which a whole bunch of corporations banded together to pay a bunch of fancy lawyers to convince the Supreme Court to decide that free speech equals unlimited amounts of bribe money given to politicians. Corporations have the right to do that now. We don't have the right to do that, but they do. And for many, this was the first time they ever heard of this concept of corporate personhood, but this legal fiction has a long history, going all the way back to 1886. And ever since then, the Supreme Court has been granting corporations one special privilege after another in a whole series of court cases over the generations. Until now, corporations have more rights than humans have rights in this country. A corporation's right to make a profit trumps a community's right to have clean water. Every time. That's the law in the United States. Communities that try to pass communities like these river animals that are trying to protect their water, they're trying to protect this water privatization monster from sucking it all up and turning the water droplets into money sacks. If they try to pass an ordinance that says, high volume pumping is not allowed, Nestle's not allowed, anything like that, Nestle and their lawyers will come in and sue them. And they do this crazy thing that involves the Fifth Amendment. You all know the Fifth Amendment, right? That's the one that says that you can't be forced to testify against yourself in court. But there's also this little piece of language in there that says something about that private property cannot be turned over for public use as a punishment. And corporate lawyers have used that to say, oh, well, hey, we got a permit from the state to pump this water out of the ground. Therefore, all the water under the ground is our private property. Therefore, any law that says we can't pump it out is infringing upon our Fifth Amendment rights. And therefore, we're going to sue you and not only make you repeal that law, but make you pay us millions of dollars for all the lost profits in this time that it took us to, we've been, running around like this. So, I want to tell one more story that really kind of brings it all together and shows how extreme of a situation we're in right now. I just heard this on Democracy Now!, which is a great radio program. If you haven't heard of it, check it out. This happened pretty recently. There's a town in northern Alabama called Uniontown where people are being buried under toxic waste. There was a huge environmental disaster in Tennessee in 2008. A bunch of coal waste spilled out. It's the second largest environmental disaster in U.S. history. The first largest is the BP oil spill. One happened in 2008, the next one happened in 2009. A lot of people didn't hear about it because the coal company is very good at covering it up. But in that accident, 1.1 billion gallons of concentrated toxic waste, the stuff that's left over after burning coal, so it's the nastiest part, it's the lead and the arsenic and the mercury and the uranium. And it was inside of a pond, it was covered in water so it wouldn't blow in the wind. And the levee broke and 1.1 billion gallons of it spilled out and flooded a rural community, flooded 2 rivers, wreaked a lot of environmental damage. And then in 10 years since then, they've been cleaning it up and they've been dumping it in a giant pile outside of Uniontown. It's on private property, of course, but this town, which is mostly poor, mostly African American, they now have 4 million tons of this stuff sitting in a pile where it's not covered in water anymore, so it's blowing in the wind, it's getting in people's lungs, it's causing asthma, it's causing nerve damage, it's causing cancer. These people protested against it. They said this is a civil rights violation. The corporation that owns the dump sued them, and then the EPA took the corporation's side and said everything is proper. There's nothing you can do to reverse this. We're not going to clean up a drop of it. And by the way, screw you all, right? And so, with superhuman legal status combined with these rubber stamping regulators, it seems like corporations are untouchable. It's because the game is rigged. Because we have these shady characters running back and forth between big business. Here you see the New York Stock Exchange, looks like an ATM, spitting out dollars to fund these destructive industrial development programs, projects, and big government. The US Capitol is a laserjet printer spewing out permits that are getting rubber stamped without even reading them. And you see up at the top there's these shady backroom deals going on. So we have these corporate lobbyists are becoming politicians and vice versa. We've got stuff like here in the state of Wisconsin, the way the mining regulations have been changed. Did y'all know this? Here in Wisconsin right now, ever since Scott Walker took office, or since he got actually re-elected, they passed a law that made it so that the DNR, if they receive an application for a mine, they can either say yes or we need more information. They're actually not allowed to say no, this is going to harm the environment and people and our beautiful state. It's not allowed anymore. So in many states, now there are literally no legal means by which we can stop a destructive mine or pipeline. They give us opportunities to have public commentary. Sometimes people write petitions, but none of this stuff really matters. They're not really paying attention. And this brings us back around to this concept of neoliberalism, right? It is, like I said before, if you don't understand what that means, don't worry, nobody does. But I will say one thing about what it means. Noam Chomsky has this really good quote. He says, there's only two things you need to know about neoliberalism. One is that it's not new, and two is that it's not liberal. It's actually the same old story of colonization all over again. You could call it corporatism. Neoliberalism is this sort of idea that the corporations should reign supreme, they should rule everything, they should own everything. Uber privatization. So we could call it neo-colonialism or corporate colonialism. And the connection to disaster capitalism is that these so-called natural disasters, the worst effects are actually caused by the inequalities and oppressions that are created by colonialism. And after another generation of rebellions, here I'm talking about historically the 60s and the 70s, a lot of movements globally for democracy and dignity and human rights and to fight against colonialism and capitalism. But after that, during the 80s, the empire struck back with neoliberalism. The plan was to roll back all the gains that people have been fighting for all this time. And now this regime of corporatism, they're trying to export it to other parts of the world as well. This copy machine monster is spitting out one-size-fits-all development plans to represent free trade agreements that are making it possible for corporations to go into other countries and cancel their environmental regulations and their labor laws and sue them for millions of dollars in lost profits because they're trying to protect people's health and dignity. And this brings us back to that story about Zapata and the Mexican Revolution, because when NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was signed, it actually permanently changed the Mexican Constitution and removed most of the protections for that communal land. And ever since 1994, when it went into effect, a lot of that communal land has been getting bought up by foreign corporations. And that's the whole reason that the Zapatistas rose up, to protect their land and protect their indigenous lifeways. And we'll talk about them a little more later. But the last thing I want to say is to talk about how free trade agreements and this new model of corporatism, how they affect borders. So under neoliberalism and free trade agreements, money and corporations can move across borders much more easily, but people no longer can. In fact, borders are becoming more militarized, more dangerous, more like this scene of genocide, where we see troops are executing these ants. To kind of put it into perspective, why this is important to what we're talking about tonight is that when Hurricane Irma hit Florida, they estimate that up to 5 million people evacuated the state. And they were able to do that because there wasn't a wall on the Georgia border. There weren't these, armed border guards, or there weren't, crazy white supremacist militias, or any of the stuff that people face. And it's important to recognize that so many people around the world who are losing their homes to war or to natural disasters, they try to find refuge somewhere else, and they're just encountering more danger and more violence and more oppression everywhere they go because of this sort of what is still a very colonial regime.
You can identify what we're experiencing right now as settler colonialism. We're living in a state where now the colony has been settled, the entire continent, if not the entire world, has been explored, exploited, and expropriated for material gain from these, colonizers who wear suits and ties now. And so when we look at this image here, we see these 5 masked individuals, these 5 people who represent these different forms of privatization. I got into a heated debate just yesterday about capitalism. Someone wanted to say that, capitalism is just this free form of exchange where we can just share, a lemonade stand is capitalism, and so breaking these things down when we're talking about private property and personal property, I think people oftentimes conflate the two things. When we think of privatization, we think of taking from what was once in the public. So your toothbrush would be a part of that. I'm not coming for your toothbrush when I say that I want to abolish private property. What I'm saying is I want to abolish these different systems which allow these masked figures to create this wake of destruction behind them. On this table here, we see the candles which say 500, recognizing the 500-year history of colonization. We also see this image of Noah's Ark, which sort of breaks down this idea of the religiousness of capitalism, of colonialism, and neoliberalism. If we were to break down the actual magnitude of the stolen wealth on this planet right now, 8 men who have names and addresses and homes and families, these are real human beings, they own as much wealth as the bottom 50%, 3.5 million people, all of humanity. So thinking about that fraction alone, this old antiquated idea of the pyramid structure is actually something that's grossly misinterpreting the sort of exponential point at which we're at right now in human history, where these really, really, really estranged individuals have a lot of wealth, once again, which has been stolen and leached from the working class, while the rest of us are somewhere down, spread out on the middle and the wakes. And so then, also moving into this next slide here, a Walmart bulldozer. Thinking about Walmart as this device which is pushing off the edge of a cliff here, access to medical, food, and reproductive or recreational, the way in which we reproduce ourselves, goods, as well as mom and pop shops. Thinking once again about the concentration of wealth on the planet, if we were to take the 100 top gross domestic products, the annual production of wealth on the planet, and include into that not just nation states but also corporations, 69 of those 100 would be corporations. Walmart would end up in 10th place. So if we're thinking about the G20 summit, the global summit of 20, where some of the largest gross domestic product producing countries in the world come together and plot how they're going to lay down the chessboard for the next financial year, it would be an interesting thought experiment to think about different corporations like ExxonMobil or Walmart showing up at these events and being included in these discussions. Walmart, if we were to do that, would actually come before both Spain and Australia.
We're there at the Belvedere.
We know that they're having summits. We know that they're doing backdoor deals. But thinking about who runs the world is a really, really terrifying thing. So when we're talking about corporations, we're talking about privatization, taking once again what was from the common and putting it into private hands, actually stripping the earth of resources, human bodies, ideas, genetic material. We also see the school to prison pipeline, which I like to see in this image here. Well, I don't like to see it, but it happens to be a really easy one to point out here. We see this other bulldozer, which is now pushing off the edge of a cliff. School, access to curriculums, the arts, and once again, recreational activities for children. And behind it is pulling this prison. And there's a nod to the modern enslavement of prisoners today with this sewing machine in the background here. Once again, thinking about the connection to Walmart of these large producers exploiting these incarcerated workers. And next, with Houston, talking about neighborhoods, talking about the chessboard, we also have the city that has one of the highest per capita concentrations of oil refineries in the entire world. West Street recovery has been picking up after the wake of Hurricane Harvey. You know, we're about 8.5 months now after the wake of that storm, and people who were being exposed to toxic floodwaters were risking life and limb to save their neighbors. People that they had maybe established really strong relationships already, maybe people that they had never met before. But people who were able to have a leg to stand on were saving people and rescuing people and providing resources to those who might have not. And so into the next slide, we'll see out of the wake of this disaster, Westry Recovery, they have a really great zine on the back table that I highly recommend titled A Window Propped Open. They explain their day-by-day process of just taking flood maps and poverty maps, laying the two, and finding where those intersecting points were and reaching out to people in those spaces. They're using the Zello app, which is a phone application that you can get on your smartphone as long as you have service. It's like a radio operating system, and so you're able to reach out to and hear correspondence from all sorts of different types of people. And so they were listening in to where different calls for distress were being made and where those different state and non-state agencies were responding to those different calls for aid. And through that process, they were able to then chart out where on this map that they had created, all of these different people were being ignored and neglected, and that's where they chose to go. And that's where they chose to do their aid, was mostly in their own communities. And so if we look up here and we see these spiders, we can think of webs. And if we think of the images below of these morel mushrooms, which I hope to see pretty soon, we can also think of, once again, mycology, which is like a web. These intersecting nodes. Not only is Westry Recovery trying to just respond to the crisis, but they're actually trying to create a new social order so that they can not just have to respond to these things, but create more resilient societies through these things that don't have these mechanisms built in of self-reliance to a greater source like the state or these nonprofits that are coming in and always fail them consistently. And so thinking also about foraging and constructing new treaties, constructing new legislations and new social pacts so that we can protect ourselves and go into these different disasters with a little bit more assurance that we're all here together and that we're exchanging freely together in a way that's truly collective and liberatory. Moving lastly into this Trojan horse style train, which is coming in and decimating native cultures of plants and also language, a sense of time, all of these different things which are important to a community. We see it being driven by Monsanto and these new corn conquistadors. We also see it being fueled by Shell Oil. So once again, we see this interplay within these different industries, food and oil, also war, coming together and coalescing and stealing these heirloom variety seeds in the bottom right-hand corner here from these native indigenous ants. And so I'd like to use this as a point to just sort of highlight a little bit more, and Jimmy will get a little bit more into them, about the CIW, the Coalition for Immokalee Workers. For the past, like I said, 3 decades, they've been fighting against these large corporations and winning. They've been able to bend the knees of these large corporations, starting off with Taco Bell, moving into Publix, even Whole Foods and Walmart, to abide by what they call the Fair Food Program. Once again, that's something to ensure their sexual safety and accountability practices, access to shade, water, and food, and breaks, and then also getting a penny more per pound of tomatoes that they're picking in this large industrial agricultural city. And along with them, if we can think of the principles that we were talking about earlier, the principle of mandar obedeciendo, the leading by obeying that comes from the Zapatistas, they've created what they call SFAs, or Student Farm Worker Alliances, where these different on-campus student-led coalitions are leading by listening to the Coalition for Immokalee Workers and creating boycott strategies and solidarity strategies to start to spread awareness and actually put real pressure on these corporations, because, let's face it, when we're talking about a bunch of brown illegal immigrants that are working in fields and comparing those to a bunch of white upper middle class students, we know where the power lies when it comes to the perspective of these corporations. And so the CIW has been very wise in creating these long-reaching networks, which have been able to put down, I think, about 27 companies now at this point to the Fair Food Program, with this really strong tie to these different networks across the country. Right now they're fighting Wendy's. And so I got to go and talk to them as they were getting prepared for a huge, colorful festival of resistance against Nelson Peltz, who is the CEO of Wendy's up in New York. I got to paint banners with kids, and we got our hands all painty, and we did a lot of really fun stuff. But we got to, at the same time, talk about resistance and strategies to create these longer networks that are truly based on solidarity and not just charity. We can think of all of these different examples of water. And moving into the very last slide, that phrase, that battle cry, that hymn that came out of Standing Rock and that rebellion was "Water is life." And so if we think of this image here, we see Nestle represented as this corroded water bottle monster. We think of that life force of the planet being corroded itself. But it can be remediated, and we're the ones that are responsible for doing that. We're the ones that are the inheritors of this world. And so we see these different diverse tactics being employed across this map, where we see this, once again, Hydra beast spreading out its different tendrils into the earth and sucking up these different resources, whether these be natural resources like water or oil or coal, all of these different extraction processes that can seem overwhelming. If we build these strategies together, and if we talk, and if we hear from each other, and if we check in with each other, if we build these strong networks, something that I saw in Standing Rock was really, I think, representative of this, is that because there was such an overwhelming force, because there was this connection to water, because we're fighting Line 5 up in Michigan, because we have the Flint water crisis, indigenous and white allies, indigenous people and white allies had rushed and flocked to Standing Rock to provide solidarity in that camp and to learn and to exchange from people who were in this active struggle. There was about 50 people in the Michigan camp, which I thought was really interesting. What I'm trying to say is that if we create these networks, we can use these diversities of tactics, from militant direct action to using picket signs and everything in between, to start to, once again, respond to the overwhelming force, the shock and awe of these different corporations and their tactics, the tactics of the state, and we can start to create this festival of resistance, or as my friend Cindy Milstein likes to say, a place of rebellious mourning. She has a really great book titled Rebellious Mourning, The Collective Work of Grief, wherein she talks about how when we create spaces to be candid and open with each other, to lay ourselves down bare before each other and our comrades, our families, our neighbors, we can create systems where we're healing, where we can draw on that ancestral wisdom of creating rings of affinity, and we can start to heal. And in so doing, we can start to construct a new world. And we can think of these different contemporary examples. We can think of contemporary struggles, and we can build solidarity with them, we can build connections, and we can start to respond, and not just have to respond, and not just have to patch up these different holes in the quilt, but build a new one altogether that makes room for all of us.
So many of us in this country got our start to grassroots people power disaster response by responding from a call by a former Panther, Malik Rahim, in New Orleans after Katrina. At the time, there were white vigilantes that were roaming the streets of his neighborhood, shooting and killing unarmed black men by the dozens. And this is the same time when people were stranded at the Superdome, not getting supplies, and folks around the country and around the world watched, kept thinking someone was going to come, and bring something, but nobody did. And so eventually we filled up our trucks and buses and cars and loaded it with supplies and drove out, responding to this call for solidarity from a former Black Panther. And most people think what made the Panthers so much of a threat was the armed component, but it was actually their survival programs. Survival programs were meant to meet people's immediate needs for survival while simultaneously raising consciousness. The Panthers' most famous one was a free breakfast program, but they also had a free grocery program. They did sickle cell anemia testing and education. They opened up clinics. They accompanied elders to their doctor's appointment and other things when they were afraid of muggings. They did community-wide pest control. They and Black Panther Party prison chapters organized to stop rape and other abuses in prison. And they occupied Lincoln Hospital and Detox in New York City and made it into a comprehensive drug detox center treating addiction using acupuncture and meaningful work and things like that, along with other organizations. And I'll get back to that in just a minute, but these snails right here, they represent, they're a symbol of the Zapatistas. When, the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect, the Zapatistas came down from the mountains and they took over city centers. They said, as soon as they, got recognition, they put down their weapons and they said our words are our weapons. But they consider what we're in right now the Fourth World War, the third being the Cold War. And so it's a war with neoliberalism on one side and humanity and the planet on the other side. The snail, it spirals backwards and inwards away from the colossal mistakes of colonialism and towards ancient rememberings. and also spirals outwards to new words, new worlds, new ways of being. And the snail too is humble and close to the earth. It reminds us that even though revolutions may start like lightning, the speed of dreams, it also takes that slow, humble, painstaking, little by little work to realize these revolutions. Oftentimes, back in the day, people thought we would trade one leader out for another, one government for another, and that would somehow set us free. But more and more people are realizing that we need a revolution of everyday life. And the Zapatistas kicked off the global justice movement when the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect. And many of us were part of that, going to the World Trade Organization demonstrations, the Free Trader of the Americas demonstrations, all these mobilizations of global capital we set up in resistance to them. And we learned through that how to set up independent media centers. We learned how to cook for large groups of people. We learned how to do street medic work, in the streets. And all these different skills in New Orleans after Katrina, they melded with the legacy of the Black Panther Party, and we were able to create many programs that responded to people's self-determined needs in really powerful and lasting ways. Here you see an example of some programs, like a kids and community program, cooking for large groups of people, water testing and soil testing, wetlands restoration and community gardens, little medic clinic work, different things like that, roof tarping across the board, whatever people needed, folks were responsive to meet those needs. And we'll talk tomorrow a lot about the mistakes that were made and lessons learned from that common ground they call themselves, and we'll talk more about how we can go in a better way, and not replicate those same mistakes. You can go to the next. And also at the same time, though, we need to be. It's not enough to just be responsive to disasters. We should be preventing them from happening in the first place, if at all possible. And so that's when going to support encampments like Standing Rock are so critical. Here you see a fox with a red power flag and a bear with a wampum belt, and they're stepping over federal property. So what we see, with these pipeline projects all around, our sense of solidarity, our willingness to take direct action, our capabilities to create medic infrastructure or to handle logistics of supplies and things like that. Those are all supplies that are needed in these different encampments. And another cool thing to connect our two movements is, in response to the Baton Rouge floods, we needed respirators so that folks could safely clean out flooded homes after the historic Baton Rouge floods a few years back. And these same respirators, we were able, after they weren't needed and used anymore in that area of Louisiana, we brought them up to Standing Rock so that it could double as personal protective safety gear to guard against the pepper spray and tear gas that folks were experiencing at Osheti-Shikomen in North Dakota. This word means it's tekio, or collective labor or mutual aid in different languages, and these are all little teacher and student plants. They're at Louisiana was privatizing the whole school system and breaking the teacher union, and the authorities had no plans to open any schools in this whole neighborhood of the Lower Ninth Ward after Hurricane Katrina. The families, of course, they needed schools open so they could bring their families back home and restart their lives. And they went to school board meetings, they did petitions, everything else, and this didn't work. And eventually they teamed up with volunteers who were in the city to do response and relief efforts. And folks broke into the school. They cleaned it up and got it so that it could be operational. And it was opened thereafter. And this is actually the only school, Martin Luther King School, in that neighborhood. And now it's an elementary, middle, and high school, and operates as a community center as well. And they're also, this is the same model that they're trying to, privatization of public schools and the public energy infrastructure, the same model that they're implementing right now in Puerto Rico as well. And here you see a rabbit with a cell phone, a graduation cap, and a U-lock, and this turtle with a video camera and a laptop. They're using the social rewards of their life experience, like access to education or social media or different things like that, to support frontline communities. Here you see a rabbit with big ears, and they know where to land because this rabbit with big ears is directing them. It's listening to the impacted communities. In New Orleans, after Katrina, there is a historic African American church called St. Augustine Church. It was going to be closed down. The community was about to lose its center of worship. And this was a historic church for a number of reasons. It was the first place in the United States where free people of color, people who were enslaved, and white people all worshiped together under the same roof. And this, the interplay between this church and Congo Square helped birth jazz and blues in New Orleans. And this church, the church hierarchy, it was untouched by the floods or the winds of Hurricane Katrina, but the church hierarchy was going to use the excuse of Hurricane Katrina to close down this church and merge it with a larger, richer church with a white priest. Parishioners weren't having it, and they again tried petitions and letter writing campaigns and all these things, and again it didn't work. The night that they kicked the priest out, we went in and gorilla glued the locks, put 4x4s on the windows and doors, and occupied the space and kept it for 2 weeks until the church hierarchy agreed to meet the parishioners' demands and keep the church open. And now to bring it back a little bit more to the present day in response to Irma, these bees are pinpointing on this map where there's the most need rather than where there's the most profit. And we created a similar map to this in Florida after Irma. We also created a hotline where folks could call in with whatever needs they had, and we would be responsive to those needs. Somebody called in asking for food and water, and so we sent out a team. And being without bureaucracy, without red tape, we were able to be responsive to all his needs, not just the ones that he requested initially. It became clear that he had diabetes, and his diabetes medicine went bad because of the lack of electricity and refrigeration. And so we were able to get his pharmacist and his doctor on call, get diabetes medicine on ice, and get back to him. While other folks cleaned up the fallen trees in his yard and the rotten food in his fridge, and also mediced him at the same time. And he talked about his days as a paramedic. He spent years as a paramedic before his health had failed him or started to fail him. And he gathered 8 boxes full of medical supplies and handed them over to us so that we could continue doing medic work in other neighborhoods and communities. And this is a perfect example of what we mean by mutual aid. Not powerful givers of aid on one side and powerless receivers of aid on the other side. Instead, we're all in this together, and it's this mutual process that's contributing to everybody's empowerment and liberation. We're all, it truly is mutual. He had also talked to us about how the night before he called 911 because a white neighbor on one side of his house was brandishing a gun at him. And of course the police show up, they go to his black neighbor on the other side, and he's yelling into the 911 operator, into the phone, about, that's you got the wrong person, he's crying, please let him go. And eventually they let him go and go to the white neighbor who brandished the gun, ask to see the gun, shake his hand, and then leave. And so building off of our core value that Peyton went over earlier of intersectionality, we got these folks in touch with the local Black Lives Matter group and other organizations that could seek justice in their case and help get the 911 call transcripts and recordings so that we could prove what was going on. Also, right before Irma hit, there was a sheriff in one of the counties in Florida that sent out a statement saying if people were looking for safety and trying to flee this potential deadly event, they'd find a safe and secure shelter in a Polk County jail. So basically criminalizing people seeking safety. And so at the same time that we called the prisons and jails, making sure people weren't going to be abandoned to the potential floodwaters, we also contacted local shelters, and we asked, do you have law enforcement checking for warrants or immigration status? And most of them were, and the ones that weren't were already at capacity. So building off of the community organizing that was being done in the area already, we contacted a local mosque that was able to open its doors and not check for immigration status, not check for warrants, and even open their doors to people experiencing homelessness as well, who at official shelters were made to wear separate wristbands that were marking them as other. And even further down south, they were involuntarily committed to mental hospitals for refusing to go to these segregated shelters, and they were, this together with, the folks at that mosque were able to welcome people similar to this bird, right that you see here. And then this fox has this little banner that says, "Which side are you on?" So other organizations that do disaster response, they claim neutrality or impartiality, and we don't. We side with the poor and oppressed. We see disaster relief work, disaster response work as social justice work, whose larger aim is freedom from oppression and collective liberation. And so we know that our movement friends are going to be responding, in their local communities when a disaster hits. And so we reach out to them. And when Irma was hitting Southwest Florida, we reached out to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and we did a simple thing. We just listened and asked, "Hey, what do you need?" And then they eventually gave us a needs list, and we were able to fill up box trucks full of supplies and get over 10 tons of requested supplies like Gatorade and food and socks and different things down to this hard-hit migrant farm worker community. And then you see this spider, these different spiders doing care packages and different little programs. So at the same time that we were doing Irma response in Florida, a lot of the folks who were doing that had family ties to Puerto Rico. And so this is how we began sending teams down there and building off the knowledge that was getting out at the time. We knew that supplies were sitting in warehouses and not getting out to the people. So when our team went down there, they just drove up to the Emergency Operations Center and they flashed their mutual aid disaster relief badges, and they said they were there for an 8 a.m. pickup. Eventually they were let through, able to get the supplies, and day after day after day get those supplies and then pair it with pop-up clinics throughout the island to remote areas. And then most importantly, component of this is we also made mutual aid disaster relief badges for local community organizers so they could continue this supply hookup. Because they knew already how to respond to their own community's needs. They just, didn't have that access, and we were able to put our foot in the door to then, help the community lead its own recovery. And you can go to the same crew before they left, they're actually swatted. If you're not familiar with this term, it's when folks call in a fake 911 call saying like kidnapping or bombs or guns or something like that. The SWAT team showed up to our operations center in Guaynabo in Puerto Rico. They descended onto the roof, they broke down the windows and doors, and they forced everybody out at gunpoint. And they didn't ask about kidnapping or guns or bombs, but they did ask if anybody ever organized against fascism. They asked if anybody ever advocated for the overthrow of the U.S. government, and they asked if anybody ever raised their fists. And it's, of course, absurd for humanitarian workers to be targeted like this, but it shows what lengths our opposition will go, when we present a counter narrative and build power from below. And our work in Puerto Rico evolved to supporting the CAMs, the Centros de Apoyo Mutuo, or mutual aid centers that sprang up throughout the island. Here you see that fox again walking over federal property. A lot of these mutual aid centers, they're in former governmental buildings. So they took what was once social security offices or schools or things like that and turned them into community centers where they would meet each other's needs for shelter, for food, for different things like that. And here you see different animals sharing food and other goods with each other. A lot of times how these CAMs would spontaneously operate, spring up would be that one person in the whole neighborhood has a gas stove, that will work, with the lack of electricity. And so everybody goes to that one, house to cook communal meals for the whole community, and then organically, spontaneously, it evolves into creating more and more programs meeting each other's needs in a really powerful way. And these folks are experiencing some repression now. It's been several months since Hurricane Maria, and different city governments are, wanting to squash this people-powered, mutual aid efforts that are really powerful and liberatory. But people are fighting back and successfully, holding space and creating community out of this chaos. And another cool program that we were able to do in coalition with the Centros de Apoyo Mutuo was we got a pure water purification system down to them, and this is a water purification system that is operated by a seesaw. Ours wasn't, but it was modular. And so it didn't require electricity, it was just a pump system. And it could take whatever non-salt water source and turn it into clean drinking water. And we were able to again leave this water filtration system down to local, community organizers, so they could continue water brigades throughout the island, cleaning and filtering people's water. Because we know that we can't rely on Nestle, when it comes down to it. Yes, we're going to be passing out water bottles of water, but also we're thinking more strategically about building sustainable and autonomous infrastructure so people can meet their own needs in a sustainable way at the same time. We're doing the same thing with solar, getting solar infrastructure down to these local mutual aid centers as well. Here you see the different bees doing little weatherization projects to these different homes for solitary bats and other creatures. In New York, when Superstorm Sandy hit, Occupy Wall Street transitioned to disaster response and named themselves Occupy Sandy. And there are actually FEMA employees that knew about people who they were going to be, freeze to death over the brutal winter in New York if they didn't get immediate help. And the FEMA employees knew that their hands were tied with their bureaucracy and red tape. So they actually reached out to Occupy Wall Street volunteers, who were then able to go to these folks' residences and weatherize it and get it operational. And even the Department of Homeland Security afterwards issued out a report saying that this network-based model is actually way more effective and responsive and efficient to meeting people's needs than that top-down command and control model. It's actually called the Resilient Social Network is the paper that they had published. And here you see bees talking about permaculture up here, and sustainable building design down here. Another cool program that we're working on in coalition with other groups is this thing called We Have Room. So it's the idea is to create something like couch surfers, so that people everywhere can open their doors to people who are internally displaced because of these climate-related disasters. Whether you have a couch or a spare room or just an empty space to camp, people can open their spaces for people fleeing these climate-related disasters to find some place of refuge. And here you see, peligro, danger, with these, at the same time that we're talking about these really visible climate-related disasters, we also recognize invisible disasters, that oftentimes it's a difference in degree, but not in kind, from that ongoing experience of social and economic inequality. All the time, there's hundreds of people crossing the border from Mexico into the U.S., and hundreds of people are dying, and there's actually mass graves on the border where the authorities say the people within those graves are, quote, illegal, but the mass graves are not, and people are dying of thirst. And so No Mas Muertes, No More Deaths, is a great another organization that's doing humanitarian direct action, and they're actually receiving a lot of repression right now. They put down gallons of water with messages of solidarity in key spots in the desert so that folks won't die of thirst. And the Border Patrol will actually come down and destroy these gallons of water, and they've even started arresting the humanitarian workers. One is facing over 20 years in prison for doing just this, basic, kindness and compassion in response to the border regime. This ant is carrying a flag that says "Un no, mucho si," one no, many yeses, reminding us that we can be united about what we're up against, but recognize that we all have different calendars and geographies. We all have different contexts depending on the local situation. The answers will be diverse. And here you see a scene with all these endangered animals representing frontline communities. You see this bat here with, again, big ears, highlighting the importance of listening. You see all the bookshelves up here representing our elders. Every time an elder dies without passing down their knowledge, it's like a library has been burned down. And you see this empty chair here too, representing how there's always room in our movements for more people. There's a seat at our table if you care to join us. There's always, everybody has valuable skills and knowledge and experience, and we need all of us to turn the tide against disaster capitalism. And they're all strategizing together using popular education models to build power from below and unite against what is a threat to their survival. So in a sense, like we can think of neoliberal capitalism and colonization as an ongoing disaster. The meaningless drudgery of the work, the loss of authentic social relationships, the isolation and alienation, the destruction of the air, the water, almost everything we need to survive. And then what we see with a flood or a hurricane or an earthquake is that even though these things are incredibly traumatic and full of suffering, they also, in a sense, wash away that unnameable disaster that is everyday life under neoliberal capitalism. And in this space, without coercion from above, people are free to reimagine new social roles, to share goods and services with each other freely, to create something together, to build something together, even if it's just an idea that can withstand the crises that are sure to come. We know it's going to be climate related. It can also be economic or political, but we know also that if we wait on the state to save us, we're not going to survive. If we wait on the nonprofit industrial complex to save us, we're not going to survive. If we have a hope for survival, it will come from each other in these relationships of mutual aid, of people helping people. Dorothy Day said in response to the San Francisco earthquake that while the crisis lasted, people loved one another. And we want that love to last, to stretch out these temporary autonomous zones where we are free to reimagine new social roles, where we share goods and services with each other freely, and work outside of the dictates of the market to build something together that is truly lasting and transformative. And Buenaventura Durruti, an anti-fascist during the Spanish Civil War, he said that our opposition might blast and ruin its world before it exits the stage of history, but we're not in the least afraid of ruins because we carry a new world here in our hearts, and that world is growing in every moment. And we know, you're part of that growing world as well. And what we hope to do is be building these relationships of solidarity, because we know these oppressive toxins and toxic oppressions do threaten to drown us all in the near future. But we believe in people power, that we can build communities of solidarity that have each other's backs, and that's what we're trying to do over the today, tomorrow, over the coming years, is to build these networks so that when crises come, we can have each other's backs. We can be there for each other in real powerful and inspiring and lasting ways.